Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is February 15th, Wednesday. In fact, February 15th, not the other kind of February 15th that you might have been thinking was the case. No, it's the Wednesday type. And it's not always a Wednesday, February 15th. That's the way our calendar works. Anyway, today is Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. That's another thing. The year keeps changing as well, albeit somewhat slower. So usually we're able to keep up with things like that. But it causes problems, believe me. Anyway, ready? No, not really, to roll today, but here we are nonetheless, battling the tail end of the cold, and, I think things are improving. Not too bad, and still fiddling around with a cold ease lozenge at this point, just trying to keep things as clean and neat as possible and suppress the cough, etc., and proceed on with the day's events. Let's see. All right, we got lots to catch up on, and it is Wednesday, so we'll be hearing from Greg Dworkin with his Raft O stories not long hereafter, I guess. I was going to say thereafter. That's the usual go-to, but we're here, and so it becomes, I guess, the hereafter. We're not dying and going to the hereafter. It's just going to happen hereafter. That's all. No, religious implications, no next life implications. Just saying it's going to happen. All right. Well, let's see. Many things, like I said, to catch up on, including, finally retirement of Senator Dianne Feinstein. I'm sure that will be on Greg's list at some point, but I guess some more indication that it was, of course, as most people, I think, by now know, time for her to, long past, I think, really, time for her to consider retirement. But there were even reports that though she had made a decision and, I guess, at some point instructed her staff to put out a statement announcing that she would not be running for re-election, when it came time to hold press availability about that announcement, it had slipped her mind that she had actually put that statement out or given the go-ahead for the statement to be put out. So, a little bit further evidence that, you might want to spend some time with friends and family while you can. And goodness. So anyway, long career, lots of people lining up to run behind her. Campaigns have already begun. Several members of the House delegation already thinking about running for higher office. And, you'll have plenty to choose from. It'll make a difficult choice because there's a lot of people with a lot of great qualifications already dipping their toes in the water. Okay, let's see. Other things to think about, and there are many, include this latest that I just happened to flip through from, this online source. It's a blog, Daily Kos, perhaps you've heard of it. But I happened to see in the morning email circulating the top stories, as they frequently do. This news from my own state of Virginia, or rather Commonwealth, if you are into that sort of thing. Virginia lawmakers approve anti-queer bill that mandates public schools out youth to parents. We were, of course, just talking about this, or a similar bill in, where were we talking about? Oh, I don't know. It could be any one of half a dozen states easily that you could imagine entertaining such bills. Perhaps a recollection, perhaps it'll come to me which state we were talking about then. But now it's Virginia, albeit just in the House of Delegates, one of the two houses of the legislature, and we don't know how it will fare in the upper house. But, of course, if it manages to get through there, not much doubt about how Glenn Youngkin will treat this. As you know, he's targeting these issues and continues to labor under Chris Rufo's spell. So it would be quite likely that you'd see it signed into law if it were to make it past both houses of the legislature. This one, or rather two bills on Tuesday passed by the House of Delegates. There's the first one, HB 1387, which would, that hot button issue, ban trans girls from participating in sports teams that are consistent with their gender identity. This legislation applies to all grade levels from elementary school through college. And like just about all other anti-trans sports legislation, those in favor are trying to make an argument about fairness for cis girl student athletes, but all these trans are doing is keeping trans girls from any kind of access and opportunity. Well, I guess all these bills are doing, really, is what that should have read. In Virginia high schools currently, trans student athletes are evaluated on an individual basis. I wonder, it seems too obvious that it was Florida that we were talking about with these anti-trans bills, but perhaps I only think it's surprising because you would have thought that they had gotten to that bill earlier in Florida, but maybe they're just coming around to it. Marissa Higgins, by the way, responsible for putting together this report for the front page of Daily Kos and keeping us up to date on what's happening in my own neighborhood here. They also, it is reported, passed HB 2432, which would essentially force public school teachers and staff to out students to their parents or guardians, even if there's a possibility that the outing could lead to abuse or homelessness. Or, as I was pointing out the other day, the forbearance from outing, which should be, of course, against the rules, but, things that are against the rules don't always get effectively blocked. But I'm pointing out for the sake of argument that for all the people who think that public schools and the ranks of the public school teachers are filled to bursting with groomers and predators, why you would give them an additional blackmail tool against students that they have been able to identify as in some sort of crisis, and why you should allow them to be held hostage to these to the ranks of the predators and groomers, I have no idea. But that would be too much thought to give to any situation for these folks. This is, after all, campaign in a box work, and they don't really understand. They were just told that this is a box from Chris Rufo, and it works, so please do it. So here we are with another bill like that here in Virginia. Specifically, this bill mandates that public schools must tell at least one parent or guardian if the student self-identifies as a gender that differs from the sex assigned at birth. Not certain that all teachers will actually have access to that information, but they'll instead make some suppositions and guesses and then attempt to ruin the child's life and maybe destroy the family based on those guesses. Almost no teachers will have, of course, access to the students' birth certificates to verify that they're doing the right thing, but that won't matter because the right thing doesn't have anything to do with what this bill is about. It also says that referring to and raising the minor in a manner consistent with the child's biological sex cannot be considered abuse or neglect. In other words, if a student identifies as transgender and the parents force them we can't force them to identify, but force them to live in a manner consistent with their birth gender from which they are attempting to transition, that can't be held to be abuse or neglect. What that's doing in a public school regulatory bill, I don't know. It really belongs in something else, but I suppose it's something you could give directions to courts in considering the evidence in bringing abuse and neglect cases, which I guess just won't get brought because Commonwealth's attorneys in the various counties will be afraid to do so, thinking that they're going up against these jury instructions. Anyway, it's not terribly surprising the report goes on, that these bills were approved because Republicans have a majority in the House. They don't, thankfully, have a majority in the state Senate, and that Democratic stronghold in the Senate is likely why a handful of anti-trans bills dealing with health care and sports have fizzled before reaching Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin's desk already. And good reminder here, you might also remember that Danica Roem serves in the House of Delegates in Virginia, the first person to be elected and serve as openly transgender in the U.S. state legislatures. Roem's bravery and visibility are incredibly inspiring and likely life-changing for those who could be impacted if such hateful legislation were signed into law. But we have to focus on winning majorities and support at every level, not relying upon, say, a blue state Senate to correct the hate of a red state House. So a good reminder for those of you, I don't know, the zero of you listening to this program who are thinking, maybe I won't vote in the next elections because who cares? Everything works out in the end. I don't think we have any such listeners. All right. So I thought that was an important way to start the day. We have plenty more, of course, to roll out and share with you. I will refresh my glance at Pocket. But also I have to remember to go back to to the Bird site and search the KITM hashtag in case it's any other obscure saint days that we need to find out about. Although for that I really should be looking over at Mastodon, where John Shiflett will be letting everyone know that we're up and running. Any more saints to share with us today, John? I guess not. All right, but that was fascinating about Saints Cyril and Methodius, and it is Methodius, or I guess if you're Greek, I looked it up and I listened to some of the pronunciations just to follow up, and the Greek pronunciation, I guess, is Methodeus. Methodeus? So anyway, if you're thinking about, I don't know what, disguising yourself as a Greek or transitioning to Greek, identifying as Greek, you can do it now, at least with respect to the name of Saint Methodius. And Cyril was Kyrillios or something like that. I should have listened more carefully to that, but I was more concerned about the Methodius pronunciation instead. Anyway, let's see. Other things to share with you here. Let's see. Heading back over to the KITM hashtag. Let's see. Oh, let's look at this. This came in, I guess, yesterday. What's going on here? Bruce McFarland bringing something to our attention here. From the Arlington Democrats. Okay, thousands of good-paying jobs are going to Michigan instead of Virginia. This after Glenn Youngkin put politics ahead of Virginians and drove Ford away. You remember this story. I mentioned it to you on the air. Greg was with us at the time, and he thought that one was really odd and hadn't heard much about it. But you remember that during his State of the Commonwealth address, Governor Youngkin took the time to call out the Ford Motor Company for their well-known activities in support of the Chinese Communist Party somehow. Not really sure where that came from, but accused the company of acting as a front for the, or as they say, the Communist Party of China. This is the way it's referred to among MAGA and Republican circles, as opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't know which is right, and it doesn't really matter very much. But for some reason, this is now code among Republicans that you can wink, wink, nudge, nudge, refer to the Ford Motor Company as a front for the Communist Party of China because something, they wanted to open up, of course, a plant to build batteries for electric vehicles. And, well, for some reason, the governor opposed it. And that's all we know about it, except that he thought that this was somehow a way of allowing China to control things. They had, of course, some Chinese manufacturing partners, I am sure, but Ford Motor Company, pretty well known as an American car company. And a little surprising that he turned them away, but yeah, Bruce brings us this tweet from the Arlington Democrats reminding us of the fact that that happened. And let's see, last month, there's a little quote here from the AP News. Last month, the state of Virginia dropped out of the race for that same Ford plant. So they are on their way to Michigan instead, where Democrats hold the trifecta. So, what can you do? Anyway, there's no way you can take it out on Glenn Youngkin. He's term limited to one term anyway. He may run for something else, but very likely if he runs for president, I think he'll be taken care of by the rest of you. But you'll get your chance, perhaps, to take a pot shot at him if you're a Republican primary voter listening to the show, also near zero. But Bruce saying at this point, this reminds me of when Kasich ran for governor of Ohio, lying that he would divert the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati passenger rail funding to highways. It was dedicated rail funding, so it went to fund Wolverine corridor improvement in Michigan instead. So, yeah, well, Republican governors have a tendency to put on shows like this and refuse federal aid or federal funding when, when there's an opportunity instead to stand athwart history and assert yourself as so Republican that you refuse to cooperate in any capacity with any Democrats, even if they're trying to give you money for something you want in your state. And that trend continues to this day. How confusing and odd. All right, well, let's see. It's a little late in the show, and we have had no indication of what's going on from Greg. He's either spellbound by the discussion or perhaps having, I suppose, electrical issues that sometimes gets in the way, although usually the generator is up and running. Could be anything. Abby needed to go out for a walk. Whatever it is, take your time or take the day if necessary. Greg, hope all is well, and you'll let us know what's going on. In the meantime, of course, we have a pocket full of stories that we can proceed to. And if at any point he gets himself freed up, welcome to join us. So looking forward to that. Let's see. I thought I might share this stuff with you here. Are we in the Substack? We're going to Substack. It's a little early in the show to be resorting to the Substacks, but that sits atop the list at Pocket. This entry from Dan Moynihan's Substack, you may recall. Perhaps we've called his name a couple of times on the show. Back when we were more often on the Bird site. I don't know if this one reached me through Mastodon or some other way, but occasionally things from the Bird site still make their way through to my list. And I thought he had an interesting approach on this one with regard to the Weaponization of Government Committee headed up by Jim Jordan. Of course, they had their first big flashy hearing the other day about the Twitter files, as they like to call them. Again, attempting to signal to the MAGA troops that something known and memeable is happening, when in fact, one, it's not very interesting, and two, the truth is the opposite of the way they have presented it. But this is Dan's view of things here, a weaponization of government trope explainer. Another linguistic ruse by the people who actually want to weaponize government. Yes, once again, as with almost everything, and the saying says it's everything, every Republican accusation is a confession. As it turns out, one of the things to come out quite clearly from the so-called investigation of the Twitter files, that of course being the shorthand for the accusation that Twitter acted to give material support to Biden and the Biden campaign during the 2020 election and act to the detriment of the Trump re-election effort when Biden's campaign contacted Twitter for help in supposedly suppressing the Hunter Biden laptop and naked pictures story. And it is alleged that, Twitter intervened unfairly on Biden's behalf, but one of the things that came out is by some multiple, depending on whose estimate you're using, the Trump campaign actually approached Twitter and made demands for suppression of certain Twitter posts and general messages far more often than the Biden campaign did. And that in addition, speaking of the weaponization of government, well, for one thing, for the Biden campaign to have asked that is not a weaponization of government. It's a weaponization of something else. The Biden campaign isn't the government. However, the Trump White House was the government, and they too intervened, not just the campaign. And so once again, it's they've established that the things that they're crying about are things that they're actually doing, and in with much greater frequency, as it turns out. But again, let's go to Don's. How about Don Moynihan? Yeah, because he's the actual author of all this. We'll go to his more collected thoughts about this. The Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government began its business this week, by which he, of course, means last week, when he wrote this thing. This is written on Monday. I mean, it will surely pick up its business again, but I don't know. I gather that he started writing that last week and then only published it this week. But you get the idea. The hearings were not especially interesting, replaying old grievances of how Trump had been mistreated, with a star FBI whistleblower who turned out to have left government in the last century. Yes, that was pointed out, I think, very well by one of the newer Democratic members of the committee. And by all rights, his name should not escape me. And perhaps I'll be reminded of it here by Don's piece as we go along. But he did a fairly effective job, and should be no surprise because this is someone who served as Democratic counsel during various impeachment hearings and investigations, and so is well familiar with how you work with witnesses in this context. Anyway, what's more interesting is the way in which the idea of weaponization itself has emerged and been, well, weaponized. The creation of the new subcommittee represents the formalization of a new trope that has quickly become part of the partisan language of government, serving as a linguistic shorthand for an array of imagined misdeeds. That's usually the way these things work. As a matter of fact, in the way that woke or CRT has come to do. And I just, again, pausing to add more commentary, reminder that Chris Rufo has been very open and clear about his methodology and his intent to have people, once it catches on that people are supposed to be willing to fight against CRT, whatever that means, that it's a vehicle for you to pour anything you want, a vessel you can pour anything you want into it, identify anything that's bothering you essentially as CRT. It's fine. It's part of the plan. Go ahead and do it. So, as we say here, this weaponization meme essentially serves as linguistic shorthand, as memes do, for an array of imagined misdeeds in the way that woke or CRT has come to do. The word weaponization is intended to invoke a Pavlovian response that short-circuits actual engagement about evidence. You know the narrative already, so no need to critically assess the specifics. The article then continues with a embedded tweet from Asin here showing a video of Elise Stefanik with the commentary. Stefanik explains how Mike Pence did nothing wrong and how Trump was treated unfairly, but also how Biden's actions are a national security threat. She also says the FBI has been weaponized against Trump and is engaged in a cover-up for Biden. Sure. As it is used, weaponization appears to mean an inappropriate use of government resources to target people for unjustified partisan purposes. But weaponization by who? Really, by whom? And against whom? Well, we'll edit on the fly here. As the Stefanik example above makes clear, there is no effort to employ it even-handedly. The implication is that the federal government is coming for conservatives. Stefanik is a member of the committee, along with notables such as Matt Gaetz, who was investigated for sex trafficking by one of the agencies the committee will investigate. So, where does the trope come from? Let's see. The next section is titled here, Language, a Key Mechanism of Control for a Conspiratorial Age. I hope that there's reference, yes, there it is, to the origins of the beginning of that phrase. I see it already. One of the most influential Republican operatives in recent years, Chris Rufo. What? Who could have guessed that we would get around to Chris Rufo? built his career by popularizing CRT and groomer as smears. In building his personal brand, wink, wink, Rufo is explicit about the centrality of manipulating language and branding ideas. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying we are actively hoping that people will purposefully confuse whatever it is that they don't like with CRT and just hang the CRT label on it and use the fact that people are now mad about CRT to confuse them into being mad about whatever else it is we're mad about and we want them to be mad about. If it feels like conservative politics is increasingly centered on these linguistic misdirections, it is worth remembering Newt Gingrich's 1996 memo. I think it actually predates 1996, but whatever. Language, a key mechanism of control. Newt explained to his Republican colleagues the words to routinely employ to contrast with their opponents. I think he hangs it on 1996 because that was, of course, the year of the so-called Republican Revolution. Actually, wasn't it earlier than that? 1994 was the so-called Republican Revolution. I don't know, but I think it definitely predates 1996. And I think by almost 10 years, I think it would probably be perhaps even a late 80s vintage, that document, but it doesn't matter. Newt explained to his Republican colleagues the words to routinely employ to contrast with their opponents, and you know who their opponents were. And he has a list of just bad-sounding words that you should be using. Abuse of power, intolerant, whatever your issue is, anti-flag, anti-family, anti-child, anti-jobs, liberal, lie, betray, bizarre, limits, bosses, machine, bureaucracy, mandates. You get the idea. I'm reading it in two columns here and switching back and forth to get away from the alphabetical order in which he listed it. Very ordered, what an ordered mind, that Newt Gingrich. Well, whatever. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just checking around all my various channels to see if there was some indication what was going on with Greg, and in fact there was. It was left for me on the Bird site, which, I do less and less reading on these days anyway. But yeah, he did leave behind a note saying, no show tomorrow, taking the computer to the clinic tonight to see why it will not boot. Well, I could tell you why. It's broken. And now that you've tried unplugging it and plugging it back in again, I am sure, and that hadn't worked, I guess the clinic is the next stop. So good luck with that one. Hope all is well and works out, and we get you back in short order. All right, because I know that you have some other issues to discuss, because also parked here in my direct messages are some hints about those things. We'll just hold it in reserve for your eventual triumphant return, I am sure. And continue on then with Don Moynihan's look at the weaponization of government trope and how we got here. So you should take a look at some point, if you never have before, at the memo, or at least the list of words that comes from the memo referred to here, Newt Gingrich's Language, a Key Mechanism of Control memo, which was part of the beginning of the candidate in a box exercise in general. This was in response, this memo, as I recall, the language of the memo says, it starts off by sort of doing the humble brag, I guess, maybe it's not even humble, to say, Newt gets asked all the time, how can I learn to speak like you? Well, here's how. There's a list of words you should use. It's down to that. And by the way, for those of you, I don't know, who have come to know only the latter day Frank Luntz, who I guess poses himself as something of another Trumper, but not exactly never, but, somewhere in the opposition camp. This was Frank Luntz's work that Newt Gingrich was presenting as his own, generally speaking. But this was his work that he had focus grouped these words to death and decided that these were the words that people ought to use for this. There was a list of opposing words, and then there was a list of words that you should use when describing Republicans and Republican initiatives as positive, optimistic, governing words, as I recall it was labeled. But anyway, you can guess what the difference between the lists were. So, back to Don's thoughts on this. Is what we are seeing now the same old thing, new wine in old bottles? A 2023 edition of the Gingrich memo would expand the lexicon to include terms like deep state, social justice warriors, groomers, CRT, woke, and now weaponize. This reveals that the new linguistic attacks reflect the changing nature of the Republican Party, centered less on traditional conservative ideas and more on an anti-state conspiratorial version of populism. Next up, how a trope became a congressional subcommittee. The weaponization of government, or rather the idea of weaponization, is not new. You can find the term in past Fox coverage, for example. Journalist Matt Gertz, not to be confused with the aforementioned Matt Gaetz, as is a meme in itself, took a look at the prominence of weaponization on Fox News. It turns up, for example, Sean Hannity, it turns up, or maybe really turns out, for example, I see, it turns up, early on. For example, Sean Hannity in 2017 saying, "We now have proof that intelligence wasn't the only powerful government entity that was weaponized by the Obama administration." But anyway, it is an episodic rather than a constant theme at that point. And embedded here is Matthew Gertz tweeting directly to Don Moynihan saying, "I'm reviewing," I guess I'm, is implied here, "reviewing Fox transcripts. The language first shows up in to describe the IRS targeting story in 2014. Okay. Oh, I see. All right. I'm trying to edit/read on the fly. But it's fine as written. If you read it with a slightly different emphasis, he's telling Don Moynihan, reviewing Fox transcripts, I would say comma here, and the language first shows up to describe the IRS targeting story in 2014, then a spike in 2019 regarding Russia probe origins, then another in 2021 regarding January 6th investigation and school parents, and then takes off in 2022. Weaponization, of course, implies a martial aspect. It is similar to the linguistic trick of calling the Biden administration the Biden regime to evoke an illiberal approach to governing. It carries the whiff of a rogue state implementing Stasi-like operations to suppress dissent. Federal agencies have a long and sordid history of illegally targeting American citizens to gain political advantage. Government agencies like, but not limited to, the FBI, DHS, and DOJ are actively working to silence and suppress citizens who subscribe to ideas that differ from the regime's, says the Center for Renewing America, who are probably crazy. You probably have not heard of the Center for Renewing America, but it offers an important insight into both the origins and meaning of the weaponization trope. And herein embedded is a picture of perhaps either something from a slide deck of theirs or maybe their website, which, let's see, begins, or is the slide title, Investigating a Woke and Weaponized Government, a Church-Style Committee, dated October 3rd, 2022. That was, I guess, probably part of the pitch for hoping that news organizations and Americans in general would take the weaponization of the federal government subcommittee to be a successor to the Frank Church headed investigative Senate committee. And Joan has written extensively about just how ridiculous and insulting that is to the actual legacy of Frank Church. The Center for Renewing the Center for Renewing America is a Trump-aligned think tank. As best as I can tell, that is Don, the center promoted the idea of the weaponization committee in the form it has now taken before anyone else. Last October, characterizing it as a church-style committee, the center stated, "We call on members of Congress to assemble a standalone committee," they didn't, "with broad investigative powers focused on woke and weaponized agencies and personnel within the federal government." GOP hardliners who opposed Kevin McCarthy's leadership bid used similar terminology when they successfully demanded, in a December 8th letter, that McCarthy form a church commission-style committee to target weaponized government. The Center for Renewing America is led by Russ Vought, V-O-U-G-H-T, a Christian nationalist and former head of Trump's budget office. Well, I want to focus on Vought because he has not just helped to popularize the weaponization trope, and parenthetically it says he has been using this language since at least 2021, but he also embodies its intent and hypocrisies. Vought is an extreme partisan who, when given the chance to govern, damaged the institutions of government. He weaponized government in the worst ways while in power. Some bullet points on that here. As the Office of Management and Budget Chief, Vought pushed the Schedule F executive order that would have made it possible to fire career employees for political reasons. Vought okayed the withholding of aid to Ukraine, even though his career OMB lawyers warned him it was illegal. That, of course, the situation that led to the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Weeks after it was clear that Trump had lost the election, Vought blocked career officials from cooperating with the Biden transition team at a crucial moment during the pandemic. This prompted Dana Milbank, the dick whisperer, to write a lacerating but accurate profile, which reads, "What Russ Vought is very good at is sabotage. He's sabotaging national security, the pandemic response, and the economic recovery, all to make things more difficult for the incoming Biden administration. That he's also sabotaging the country seems not to matter to Vought, who has spent nearly 2 decades as a right-wing bomb thrower." So, that is Vought when working in government. When out of power, Vought characterized legitimate uses of government power as weaponization, such as when the FBI searched, under court order, the home of a key player in Trump's efforts to overturn the election. He is now building an, quote, army of far-right ideologues with a, quote, biblical worldview to take control of federal agencies. Vought told Axios, "We are consciously bringing on the toughest and most courageous fighters with the know-how and credibility to crush the deep state. The weaponization trope, therefore, originates from the far right of American politics. It serves the conspiratorial and anti-statist element of the Republican Party in 5 specific ways." Oh boy, I guess we're in for 5 different specific ways here, but it's important material here. By the way, I'll pause for a couple of observations. One, what Vought is telling Axios here, we are consciously bringing on the toughest and most courageous fighters, etc. They're not bringing on anybody, of course, because they're not in government. But the warning here is a re-election of Donald Trump or some near clone of Donald Trump, whether that ends up being Ron DeSantis or whatever. They can transfer this. This is essentially Mitt Romney's binders full of women have turned into binders full of Christian nationalist Nazis who they intend to place in government in order to weaponize it, of course. Remember, as with everything Gimmitarian, the weaponization of government for use against our enemies is a good thing. The weaponization of government doesn't exist otherwise, but in other words, the use of any government power against our friends or ourselves is an illegitimate weaponization. We'll show you legitimate weaponization when we take it to beat up hippies. You get the idea. That's how it works. Also, let's see. I wanted to, there was another point. I promise that there was. Oh yes, weaponization trope originates from the far right of American politics. Yes and no. And here I wanted to make some reference to the horseshoe theory, which frequently rears its head and is doing so, in ways right now that we probably ought to recognize. Some more obvious than others, and others still in development. But the old horseshoe theory, there are, of course, old school liberals who will remember from way, way back, and will remember, for instance, the Church Committee, the actual legitimate investigation into what I guess would qualify as the weaponization of government against its own citizenry, when it was chiefly used, as it still is really, chiefly used when it's turned against domestic actors, chiefly against those of the liberal persuasion. Of course, more current thinking will remind you of, for instance, the government targeting of peace activists who opposed the Iraq War, as opposed to, say, the burgeoning crisis among anti-government, neo-Nazi, and Christian nationalist circles. And that when attention was paid to them, they were shouted down by the Republican politicians who depended on these people for their rise to power. So, it is true that I think the reliance on the use of the word weaponization as a trope, I guess, perhaps has its origins among the far right. But there are still elements of the not that far left, but also the far left, if there is such a thing, who at least say, remember that there's a history of the use of the national security related agencies in particular to crack down on leftist activity. So you should be aware of this. And this is all true. But no one should confuse the work that's being done on this weaponization committee with anything that would inure to the benefit of people coming to this view from the left side of the spectrum. It doesn't work out that way. It'll eventually just become a gimmitarian issue. You might say, well, we can use this and these things should be rooted out, and we'll just use logic to show them that it's just as applicable from a leftist point of view as it is from a right-wing point of view. And the problem is that that's the point at which the right wing will abandon logic and just say, you need to get on the train to the concentration camp along with everyone else because we don't like you. Yes, your logic is undeniable, but if we exterminate you, your logic will go unheard. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, so as Don said, there are 5 specific ways in which this conspiratorial anti-statist element serves the Republican Party. First, in mainlining conspiracy theories. At a prosaic political level, an oversight committee generates headlines that damage your political opponents and show your base you are taking their concerns seriously. The formalization of the weaponization trope does so in a way that gives Republicans the opportunity to mainline conspiracy theories. Compared to the Benghazi era, there are simply more salient conspiracies for Republicans to pursue, and they are more central to Republican political identity. Committee hearings and reports can generate a, simulacrum. Oh my goodness. Is that right? Have I got that right? Of evidence to feed deep state conspiracy theories. And it's not just the deep state. Testifying before the committee, Ron Johnson Go back to the Senate, you loser. Complained that the World Health Organization has been captured by the Chinese government. Global institutions in general have been captured by the left, and that some charitable foundations are exerting far more power over public policy than should be allowed. I've barely scratched the surface in describing the complexity, power, and destructive nature of the forces we face. Shadowy global forces ahoy. And I don't know what's more, I guess dramatic, I suppose, or something like that. Shadowy global forces. Well, that's it for Purpose 1. Purpose 2, victimization as justification. A central reason why populism is dangerous is that victimization is a defining tenet. Cass Mudd's, do I have that right? M-U-D-D-E, Mudd's influential definition of populism describes it as, quote, an ideology that considers society to be separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, which argues that politics should be an expression of, oh my goodness, some French here, of the volonté générale, I guess, the general will of the people. A well-nourished sense of victimhood is a powerful justification for all sorts of actions. Weaponization serves to strengthen this victimhood narrative, reinforcing the idea that the deep state is seeking to steal not just your elections, but your entire way of life. We are merely defending ourselves, justifying our radical action. And Don's a lot easier to read, I suppose, on Twitter, where we get less French and Latin, etc., because of the shorter format. But now you can write a whole essay on the place. So I don't know. Maybe we should never stray into Substack if we're smart about things. Purpose number 3, working the ref. You all know about this one, I think. Accusations of weaponization help to work the ref. That is, to give policy decision makers reason to pause if they take action against legitimate targets. For example, the IRS targeted political groups claiming a tax deduction on the fiction that they were social welfare groups, not actively involved in politics. It targeted both conservatives and liberals, but the outrage was all on the conservative side. IRS budgets were cut. As a result, the agency has largely given up on policing violations of tax law by political activists, to the point that what seems like obvious misdeeds, such as right-wing think tanks claiming to be churches for a big tax deduction, go unpunished. Policymakers will know that if they take regulatory, investigative, or police actions that intrudes on conservative stakeholders, they will be accused of weaponization. Hearings and subpoenas will follow, such as the ones now faced by Merrick Garland at DOJ, Christopher Wray at FBI, and Miguel Cardona at Education, because of investigations into harassment of school officials that Republicans characterized as an infringement on free speech. For decision makers with limited time and resources, it's easier to simply move to another policy area or investigation that will not draw the same political heat. This is also an example of how formalization of these tropes matters. There is a vast difference between being called out by Hannity versus being compelled to respond to subpoenas before Congress. In other words, that's actually a weaponization of government, used to further the trope of weaponization of government. Hannity can do it all he likes, but if you can use the wheels and the mechanisms of government and put a government imprimatur on the trope, it makes it that much more powerful. Now, purpose 4, justification of hypocrisy. That'll be great for the Gimmitarians, right? In pointing to the juxtaposition of the announcement of the Weaponization Committee with new evidence of abuses of power by the Durham investigation, Michelle Goldberg notes the following: this squalid episode is a note-perfect example of how Republican scandal-mongering operates. The right ascribes to its adversaries, whether in the Democratic Party or the putative deep state, monstrous corruption and elaborate conspiracies. And then, in the name of fighting back, it mimics the tactics it has accused its foes of using. The sense of victimhood excuses not just extreme action, but also obvious hypocrisies. A political movement built on lock her up chants was never all that squeamish about the inappropriate use of government power. That is a great point. A defining quality of the Trump era was attacks on officials who sought to follow the law by showing how Trump was breaking it. What about Trump's politicization of the Department of Justice, obstructions of investigations, or efforts to use government powers to subvert a free and fair election? The weaponization trope helps to not just selectively ignore the misuse of government power, largely by Republicans, that has fueled American democratic backsliding. It also creates a sense that the other side is guilty. If we can defend our guy, make the other guy look just as bad. Or rather, if we can't defend our guy, If we can't defend our guy, make the other guy look just as bad. That's the tactic. Supporters focus on the alleged misdeeds of their enemies, while the media will be pulled into a perpetual cycle of whataboutism if they accurately castigate one side of being more guilty than the other of abuses. Very interesting and a good point. And one thing at the end of the previous paragraph, the defining quality of the Trump era was attacks on officials who sought to follow the law by showing how Trump was breaking it. And here's some whataboutism, but it's true. What about Trump's politicization of the Department of Justice, obstructions of investigations, or efforts to use government powers to subvert a free and fair election? And really, what could be more easily cast as the weaponization of government than his idea that he could instruct or just simply demand that the Vice President of the United States, in his capacity as President of the Senate, simply decide that the election really had a result the opposite of what everyone had learned from counting votes and thereafter reported on the news. You're the vice president. You have powers, and that includes to declare the wrong result. You should just go ahead and do it. That's the ultimate weaponization of government, or at least the attempt to do so. And now, finally, purpose number 5. I think we can get this in before we wrap up this segment. Purpose 5, towards delegitimization, deconstruction, and control of government. The defining characteristics of the Republican relationship to governing over recent decades reflect what I have previously described as delegitimization, deconstruction, and control. These tendencies seem contradictory, and in many ways they are. Undermining the trust in institutions is not a good strategy in the long run if you want to use those institutions to govern. But it is possible to see how these impulses fit together. Discrediting government provides a populist logic for disempowering those within it that they distrust, such as the career bureaucracy, and justifies asserting loyalty to narrow partisan values as a primary governing value. This ultimately is the payoff of the weaponization trope. To save government, we must burn it down and rebuild from the ashes. For example, the weaponization of the FBI to search Pervalago for classified documents triggered a rash of anti-statist rhetoric alleging that the FBI, an agency which has never been led by a registered Democrat, was irredeemably biased against Republicans and had to be recaptured. Illustrating these anti-statist tactics, Russ Vought released a budget blueprint for the new GOP House to follow. It relies on culture war tropes as a means to deconstruct much of the state. While mentioning woke 77 times, this is a budget, by the way, and weaponized 42 times, it calls for massive cuts in federal discretionary programs, $9 trillion over the course of a decade. Vought's budget is also explicitly pro-weaponization. Oh my goodness, it's hypocrisy. Someone stop them. While calling for cuts to parts of the FBI that monitors extremist groups, it advocates for a $618 million increase for FBI investigations of progressives. Why? Quote, to thwart the increasing societal destruction caused by progressive policies at the state and local levels that have defunded police, they have not, refused to prosecute criminals, and released violent felons into communities. Vought reflects the emerging view on the right, or the far right, as he has it, that the era the era of small government conservatism is over. Instead, they should actively take control of government to pursue their goals. This helps to explain the right-wing adoration of Viktor Orban in Hungary and serves as the basis for the DeSantis rise in the Republican Party. John Daniel Davidson, in The Federalist, wrote an essay summarizing this view. We need to stop calling ourselves conservatives. Oh, okay. And he says it this way. To stop big tech, for example, will require using antitrust powers to break up the largest Silicon Valley firms. To stop universities from spreading poisonous ideologies will require state legislatures to starve them of public funds. To stop the disintegration of the family might require reversing the travesty of no-fault divorce, combined with generous subsidies for families with small children. They won't be doing that. Conservatives need not shy away from making these arguments because they betray some cherished libertarian fantasy about free markets and small government. It is time to clear our minds of cant. In other contexts, wielding government power will mean a dramatic expansion of the criminal code. It will not be enough, for example, to reach an accommodation with the abortion regime to agree on reasonable limits on when unborn human life can be snuffed out with impunity. In other words, throw them in jail. Well, they'll get around to that, I'm sure. All of this sounds an awful lot like the weaponization of government, free of concerns about individual rights. If you are going to make Stasi-like comparisons with today's government, it doesn't help if your alternative looks a whole lot worse. But it doesn't worry them, of course, because they are at heart gimmitarians. They take what they want, do things the way they want, and if it bothers you because logic obtains in your mind, well, shut up, egghead lib. That's the problem with you people, yada, 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 etc. All right, we've managed to make it to the end of that rather lengthy Substack piece, and with an hour to go at that, so we can move on to other subjects as we approach our short 1-minute top of the hour break. Okay, let's see, not quite music time here. Let's see, what other items? I suppose we can continue with the gimmitarian hypocrisy theme here as we return. We can take a look at these current calls among the Republicans in the House for labeling the accusation that they want to cut Social Security as some sort of lie or fabrication. Some additional evidence to use besides, the evidence gathered with your own eyes and ears over the years. But this will supplement it. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Edwards Radio. It's just going to be, I think, a succession of articles that I think you ought to hear, and mostly in their entirety, because, I don't know, I don't edit them very well, at least beforehand. But this one, we haven't heard from in a while from Josh Marshall over at TPM, but he has this entry in the hypocrisy files, I suppose. Aside from the Rick Scott plan to sunset everything in the world, including Social Security and Medicare, there's a more explicit item out there that can be used to highlight the hypocrisy. Not that it matters to Republicans, but it might matter with others. 3/4 of House Republicans endorsed Social Security cuts just last year. Interesting, and it's illustrated with a photo of U.S. Representative Kevin Hern of Oklahoma standing there for some ridiculous reason, no doubt, speaking with Kari Lake, the insurgent would-be governor of Arizona who believes that she totally won the election and won't just go away. Like people were calling in the press openly for Hillary Clinton to do, but I have not yet seen open calls for editorials. Why won't Kari Lake just go away? But maybe I have to be in Arizona. Anyway, as Josh writes in his TPM editor's blog, with Republicans telling us collectively, who are you going to believe, us or your lying eyes? The work of de-bamboozling is never done. Don't thank me now. Just remember to sign up and become a member. All right, you should probably do that. He's a good guy. But only after signing up and becoming a member here, which is not really, there's no membership. But, that Patreon thing, which, by the way, we thank, there's new sponsors, by the way. I might as well just jump in now or I'll forget later. Especially as one of them is my mom. Hi, Mom. Right. This is getting crazy. My family shouldn't have, I feel like family should be getting like freebies or something. But there you have it. The dedication and, the origins of my commitment to avoiding hypocrisy wherever possible, right? My own family chipping in on these things. But also, I think we mentioned, I'm pretty sure we did give a shout out to Jesse Broll, who had boosted his commitment to the Patreon fund. But also Gary Oliver, who has also joined the ranks of those boosting the amount that they are contributing. Everyone has given themselves the opportunity to reevaluate and to think about it. I think that helps sometimes to think about it in terms of, well, it really is like $1 a day is $20 a month. We do a lot of shows here. So at any rate, it's a nice suggested starting point. Some people would even be willing to pay $5 for so much entertainment. One never knows. But yeah, I'm very pleased to see not only the new number of new sponsors, but it's important to make note of the fact that people then reevaluate and say, yeah, you know what, it is really, buy a trial subscription, come to love the show, and then be pestered one day to boost your contribution. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it so much. I interrupted Josh Marshall for you. Josh Marshall, he's like a very important figure. You are more important than Josh Marshall. Okay, so he made a pitch to support his community. You should absolutely do that, although I think he's doing pretty good in terms of support. But he also hires a lot more people and needs to be able to pay them. As we noted earlier, that is to say, Josh noted earlier, Republicans are now aghast that anyone would be claiming they want to cut Social Security. But last year, the Republican Study Committee, a House caucus which includes about 75% of all Republicans, released a proposed 2023 budget which included basically every kind of Social Security cut on offer. The Blueprint to Save America was what they called it, and it proposed raising the eligibility age at first to 70 and then higher if and when life expectancy goes up, which, by the way, it hasn't lately because of COVID. Thanks very much. It proposed cutting, or in their words, modernizing, the benefit formula for everyone currently 54 and under. Means testing Social Security benefits, a huge waste of money usually, means testing anything, including work requirements for some Social Security beneficiaries, which the whole point, I think, of Social Security for most of us was that it would kick in after you stopped working or when you reached the age at which, at that point, many people did stop working. So now work requirements for the program that's supposed to allow you to stop working, and allowing people to divert payroll taxes into private investment accounts, aka retirement freedom, as they like to call it. And if you want to find it, you can find the details on page 81 and 82 of the Blueprint to Save America, herein linked, as a matter of fact. Earlier, I noted there are 3 broad buckets of proposed cuts to Social Security, each more deplorable than the next, I'm sure. Oh, those were baskets, right? Anyway, these are the cuts which program foes push for. 3/4 of House Republicans just proposed steep versions of all 3 and actually included a couple more I didn't even think to mention. Republican Study Committee members are out hitting the airwaves now, claiming that none of this ever happened. In fact, new RSC Chair Representative Kevin Hern of Oklahoma, pictured above with Kari Lake, who oversaw the creation of the blueprint, says this: there is no Republican, and it's capital, no, N-O, no Republican in Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives or in the Senate that wants to cut the benefits for seniors on Social Security and Medicare. That's a falsehood. That's a lie. And embedded is his lie about that being a lie right here from Twitter. How can he be saying this? Well, Note the wording. First, we'll check the wording on this. So no cuts for current beneficiaries. At least according to Hearn and his committee colleagues, you'll be safe if you're already on Social Security. The cuts will apply to people in the workforce now. The cuts apply to everyone except those already on Social Security and those just a few years away from becoming eligible. As you can see, it's really all word games and flim-flam. Republicans are shocked, outraged, frustrated that President Biden has the effrontery to claim that they want to cut Social Security while they are simultaneously on the record proposing exactly the cuts he claims they support. Well, that's why he said, contact my office if you don't believe me, I'll send you the document. And he was talking about a different document, the Rick Scott document. That's just the first of two such documents circulated in the last year or so in which Republicans endorsed this idea. Then, of course, there was that exchange we spoke about briefly yesterday with Joan, during which Rick Scott attempted to pretend, I guess, that he couldn't see the difference between a cut and a reduction in program costs, a cut in benefits, I guess I should say, versus a reduction in program costs. You may recall that either from seeing the conversation or our description of it, I don't know if we've really completed our description of it, but he was being asked about his plans, proposed cuts to benefits, raising the eligibility age, means testing things, having work requirements, etc., means a reduction in the benefits enjoyed by beneficiaries of Social Security, a very direct cut to the beneficiaries. And he was saying, how come you call my plan a cut, but you don't call the Democratic plan a cut when the Democrats cut several $billion out of the program? And that was, of course, because the cut of several $1 billion was, well, let's allow the government to negotiate for lower drug prices for seniors as an additional benefit, then pass that savings on to the seniors so that they would pay less for their prescription drugs, thereby increasing the amount of benefits they enjoyed, but lowering the cost of administering the program, i.e. paying for the drugs. The government would lay out less money for those drugs, and seniors would be able to get them cheaper in addition. So greater benefits for a lower cost to the government. Yes, the amount of money that the government wasn't going to be spending on drugs for senior citizens in terms of subsidies is a cut from the budget of Social Security, I suppose. That's all he was hanging his hat on. How come mine is a cut, but theirs is not? Well, it's because we're describing it in terms of cuts in benefits. The Republican proposal is to give less to Social Security beneficiaries. The Democratic proposal was spend less government money and deliver more benefits to beneficiaries. That's a pretty big difference. And he just sat there, genius businessman that he's supposed to be, apparently, and could not see the difference. But that's because, or he claimed not to be able to see the difference. That may be because he, for instance, doesn't claim to understand the difference between being a genius businessman who offers a product that people like and so therefore they're paying for it and you make lots of money, or defrauding people by charging them money for health insurance and then not delivering coverage to them when push comes to shove and they need the coverage. That's not the same thing as offering somebody good coverage for a fair price. But in his view, it is, because I would only have made millions of dollars personally if I was providing people a product that they wanted at a fair price, because that's what economics says is happening in business, and no other outcome is possible. So I'm not so sure he's really the best judge of, or the best person to be parsing these nuanced situations. Anyway, let's see. Other things that I wanted to share with you, some very popular ideas being, or some very popular takes being circulated in the last couple of days. This one, very popular yesterday, published in The Guardian and written by Jason Stanley, addressing the situation in Florida quite directly and in ways that we've seen Thomas Zimmer do in the past couple of days, but perhaps a little bit more pointedly under the headline, "Banning Ideas and Authors is not a culture war, it's fascism." Get the terminology right. The media's framing of measures like Florida's African American Studies ban is a dangerous falsification of reality. It was widely shared yesterday, and I think for good reason. Now we will share it. A wave of Republican enthusiasm, yes, and that recalls for sound effects. So a wave of Republican enthusiasm for banning concepts, authors, and books is sweeping across the United States. 44 states now have proposed bans on the teaching of, quote, divisive concepts, and 18 states have passed them. Florida's Stop Woke Act bans the teaching of 8 categories of concepts, including concepts that suggest that, quote, a person, by virtue of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin, bears personal responsibility for and must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress because of actions in which the person played no part, committed in the past by other members of the same race, color, national origin, or sex. Many of the laws also target Nicole Hannah Jones's influential 1619 Project. And of course, those things go hand in hand because that convoluted explanation is their way of saying it should be against the law to make white people feel like they should be held personally responsible for slavery, which is not, generally speaking, the intent of teaching about slavery, but it's something that you invent in your own mind when they tell you the facts of slavery, and it's hard not to come to that conclusion. And if you ever broach the subject of reparations, well, that only makes it easier for you to believe that this is supposed to be some sort of declaration of your guilt, even if it's just simply an acknowledgement of the imbalance that results from the actions of someone else, true, in the past. But if the means of correcting them are in your hands in the present, well, then we need to discuss your role and whether or not it's appropriate for you to have a role. Florida, oh yes, we just did this one. The laws have already started to take effect. Administrators and teachers have been forced out of their positions on the suspicion of violating these laws, and what has started as a trickle may soon become a flood. In January, Florida's Board of Education banned AP African American Studies on the grounds that it included concepts forbidden by Governor Ron DeSantis' law, including critical race theory and intersectionality, as well as authors such as, oh boy, ready? Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Roderick Ferguson, Angela Davis, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. Oh boy, we made it all the way through without anything terribly difficult to pronounce. But as soon as I see proper names being thrown out, I start to worry. You never know what's going to come at the end of the list. The College Board chose to remove these authors and subjects from its curriculum, claiming, as it turns out, dubiously, that they did so independently of Florida's pressure. So a doubter of yesterday's entry claiming that the College Board acted on its own volition before being pressured by the DeSantis administration and acting in a slightly different way than they were demanding. Anyway, these laws have been represented by many as a culture war, and it's easy to slip into that. We've been presented that as the framing for this, but he suggests it's a poor one. This framing is dangerous falsification of reality. A culture war is a conflict of values between different groups. In a diverse, pluralistic democracy, one should expect frequent conflicts, yet laws criminalizing educators' speech are no such thing. Unlike a culture war, the GOP's recent turn has no place in a democracy. To understand why, consider their consequences. The concepts these laws centrally target include addressing structural racism, intersectionality, and critical race theory. Structural racism is the view that certain persisting structures and practices have resulted in unjust racial outcomes. For example, the American racial wealth gap, where Americans have 10% of the wealth of white Americans. In a celebrated essay for The Atlantic, Coates, one of the banned authors, investigated banking and mortgage practices of redlining and lending that left black Americans for generations unable to acquire wealth through purchasing homes. Intersectionality, introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in widely cited and impactful work, is the concept that certain groups are at the intersection of multiple oppressions. For example, black women face discrimination not just for their race but also for their gender, and that such discrimination takes its own unique form. Finally, critical race theory is, in essence, the study of these concepts, the ways practices in various domains, in housing, schooling, banking, policing, and the criminal legal system, entrench persisting racial disparities and inequalities, such as the racial wealth gap or segregated schools, even when there is no individual racist intent. The laws are manifestly incoherent. The failure to teach about structural racism will make black children born into poverty feel that their parents and grandparents are responsible for their own impoverished position relative to white children, and so will make black children feel anguish or other forms of psychological distress because of actions committed in the past by other members of the same race. The anguish and psychological distress these laws forbid are only anguish felt by the dominant racial group, white Americans. In other national contexts, everyone would clearly recognize the problematic nature of laws of this sort. Germany's teaching of its Nazi past creates clear anguish and guilt in German children, and perhaps for this reason, Germany is the world's most stable liberal democracy. If the German far right passed laws forbidding schools from teaching about the sins of Nazism on the grounds that such teaching does, in fact, quite obviously cause anguish and guilt in German children, the world would not stand for it for one moment. Even Israel's far-right government strenuously objected when Poland drafted a law that would make it illegal to suggest that Poland had any responsibility for Nazi atrocities on its soil. Why isn't there greater outcry when such laws are passed to protect the innocence of white Americans? It is frequently claimed by proponents of such laws that banning discussion of structural racism and intersectionality is freeing schools of indoctrination. And yet, indoctrination rarely takes place by allowing the free flow of ideas. Indoctrination instead rather takes place by banning ideas. Celebrating the banning of authors and concepts as freedom from indoctrination is as Orwellian as politics gets. So, what is the ultimate goal of these bans? In the first instance, these laws are there to protect white innocence. And that is why they are so popular with many white parents who carry their own burdens of guilt. Similar laws would be popular with many Germans for the same reason, but there are deeper and more problematic aims of these laws. Democracy involves informed decision-making about policy. These laws are intended to render such deliberation impossible when it comes to minority groups. The United States suffers from immense racial disparities, which result in periodic outbreaks of political protest. Without an understanding of the structural factors that keep schools and cities segregated and certain populations impoverished, Americans will not be able to react to these outbreaks with understanding. They will find them befuddling. These laws eliminate the knowledge and understanding required to react democratically to black political protest to structural injustice. The authors targeted by these laws do not just theorize about problematic structures. Their work is also essential for understanding solutions. For example, Roderick Ferguson writes about social movements for liberation, including student movements. These laws make it illegal to teach students about the history and strategy of social movements targeting structural injustice. More generally, these laws make it illegal to teach students about how to form social movements to challenge dominant interests and structures. And I guess a simpler way of putting it is to say, well, will teach kids that Martin Luther King was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a revered civil rights figure who won several civil rights victories for black people in America. We just won't tell you how or what those victories actually were. Just equality happened after that, and it's all great, and that's why we have a holiday for him. Never mind what happened to him or why it was done to him, or why other people attempted to bring him to the same fate through different means, and some of them with the imprimatur of government authority, the weaponization of government, one might call it. But anyway, just know the fact that he was a nice guy and he had some ideas about equality, and he had a dream, and then all of a sudden the dream came true, and never mind how it happened or what happened to the people who worked to make it happen while they were working to do it. Okay, lesson over. Most frighteningly, he continues, these laws are meant to intimidate educators, to punish them for speaking freely by threatening their jobs, their teaching licenses, and more. The passing of these laws signals the dawn of a new authoritarian age in the United States, where the state uses laws restricting speech to intimidate, bully, and punish educators, forcing them to submit to the ideology of the dominant majority or lose their livelihoods or even their freedom. It is clear that the chief agenda of the GOP is to advance a set of speech laws that criminalize discussion in schools of anything but the white heterosexual majority's perspective. The media's portrayal of these laws as moves in the culture wars is an unconscionable misrepresentation of fascism. Well done. And thank you to Jason Stanley for making the point, and thank you to all the rest of you who shared that point so widely on social media, such that I was motivated to read it to the rest of you. Okay, let's see. How about some continuation of some of the other themes here? Let's see. We're butting up against the next break here. How about this one? This one looks like it advertises itself as being a short read. Let's take a quick look. Jumping to another of our favorite themes, Reuters reports, and who's our reporter here? Somewhere the name, where do they put their bylines? How come it's not easy to find? I don't know. We'll see if I don't see it now any longer. But anyway, Reuters is the outlet responsible, though I feel like in Pocket it said, it did give a credit to a Guy Falconbridge, but sometimes they get the credits wrong in the Pocket version. So you go to the original, and now his name is not immediately presented as the author for some reason. But if we got it right, great. If we didn't, okay. Yeah. The editing is by Guy Falconbridge, as it turns out. Reporting by Reuters, so it just gets the general credit. Okay, if we had any hope of fitting this in before the break, we better start. Russia's Prigozhin admits links to what the U.S. says was election meddling troll farm. I think these are all things that we, quote-unquote, knew, based on intelligence reports and intensive investigation. But now, either because it's true or because it will just further the trolling, we have an admission of sorts from Yevgeny Prigozhin here. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, said on Tuesday that he founded and financed the Internet Research Agency, a company that Washington says is a troll farm which meddled in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. We're all familiar with it, I think. Prigozhin, an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, spent years operating on behalf of the Kremlin in the shadows, but has emerged in recent months as one of the most high-profile figures connected with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or the second wave anyway, or third wave, depending on how you look at it, of this invasion. He has previously admitted interfering in U.S. elections, but his statement on Tuesday appears to go further than before in outlining his specific links to the St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency. I was never just the financier of the Internet Research Agency. I thought it up. I created it. I managed it for a long time, Prigozhin said in a post shared on social media by the press service of his Concord Catering Group. Remember that he also made the bulk of his money in catering. Putin's chef, right? That's the guy, I believe. It was created, he says, to protect the Russian information space from the West's boorish and aggressive anti-Russian propaganda, Prigozhin said. That's an interesting twist. Prigozhin was first sanctioned by the United States over his links to the Internet Research Agency in 2018 and charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States. Special counsel Robert Mueller's report on his inquiry into Russia's role in the 2016 campaign and election said that the Internet Research Agency sought to sow discord in the United States through information warfare. It sought to sway the 2016 election in favor of Trump, Mueller's report said. The campaign evolved from a generalized program designed in 2014 and 15 to undermine the U.S. electoral system to a targeted operation that by early 2016 favored candidate Trump and disparaged candidate Hillary Clinton, the report said. We knew that, of course.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Whew, okay, lots to... well, we want to finish up on this Reuters report about Prigozhin's confession of sorts here. And I suppose some grain of salt is warranted with almost everything. But at any rate, it does reveal a few additional facts in the end of this thing. We left off just by noting that what the IRA, in this case the Internet Research Agency, was actually up to. And this part, I think, I don't know, maybe this is new. It seems like, maybe I've heard it before. I'm just being reminded of it. IRA employees also traveled to the United States on intelligence gathering missions. So that may or may not be new to some of you as well. Prigozhin, who spent the final decade of the Soviet Union, remember them, in prison for robbery and fraud, was for years an associate of Putin. His catering group swept up government contracts because he's into robbery and fraud, earning him the nickname of Putin's chef while he deployed Wagner mercenaries to fight alongside Russian servicemen in Syria and to conflicts across Africa to advance Russia's geopolitical interests. After years of denials, he last year admitted his links to Wagner and said he had interfered in U.S. elections. Having rapidly built his public profile both in Russia and abroad since Russia invaded Ukraine, analysts say the Kremlin has moved to clip his wings more recently, concerned about the outspoken businessman's growing stature and high-profile criticism of the defense ministry. So that might be a plot worth watching as well. There are a couple more issues here, of course, that I mean to bring to your attention, although some of these I have to just check in on just to see what's behind what's posted in Pocket. It's not always... oh, yes, okay, I recall. Oh, this is sort of an interesting tie together of, let's say, two of the immediately previous themes. Boy, there's a lot to get to here, though. Let's see. Perhaps we'll read this one because, I don't know. Well, this one from David Korn, his newsletter, which is published through Mother Jones, where he makes his publishing home anyway. But he's got the newsletter in addition to all the articles he writes. This is interesting. The Trump-Russia denialists still can't handle the truth. This is an interesting approach and brings together a couple of things, both the horseshoe theory and the theme of Russia, which the Prigozhin article just introduced. And he puts it this way. Let's make a quick read through it and see how diverted we get along the way. Again, David Korn writing this piece in his newsletter. Extreme contrarianism often entails an avoidance of facts. This is especially true for the cadre of Trump-Russia denialists who were recently out in force to bolster and amplify a massive and misguided Columbia Journalism Review critique of the media coverage of the Russia scandal. We didn't read that piece, or even some of the great rebuttals to that piece. They were extremely long, for one thing. But yeah, interestingly, Columbia Journalism Review didn't do itself any favors in giving a review to media coverage of the Russia scandal and basically coming out on the side of, maybe the whole thing was overblown and this idea that Russia was meddling in things might be just a continuing psychosis more than anything else. Really kind of extraordinary. I've already pointed out, David Korn says, what was profoundly wrong with the 24,000-word, 4-part series that one-time New York Times reporter Jeff Gerth wrote for Columbia Journalism Review, CJR. In an act of misdirection, Gerth lambasted, if you prefer that pronunciation, that stupid word. And by the way, I looked it up the other day, last time we used it. I'll save myself some save face this way. It doesn't really work, but I'll attempt jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, to save face as having said lambasted, like you're basting a lamb that's baking in the oven. Lambasted is apparently the preferred pronunciation in Australia and New Zealand. How do you like that? I'm not from either, but I'm a great admirer, let's say. And that wasn't my intention, but I have heard it pronounced that way before, and I thought maybe not from an Australian, but anyway. Lambasted, I guess, is the flat-sounding and American and English, I think, preferred pronunciation. So we'll try going with that, unless the Australians and New Zealanders among you protest, in which case I'm happy to go back to that pronunciation. But, as David Korn was saying, in an act of misdirection, Gerth lambasted the press for overstating the case that Donald Trump directly colluded with the Kremlin and for hyping the unconfirmed Steele dossier. Though Gerth scored some points on these fronts, he curiously ignored the core components of the Trump-Russia affair, that Vladimir Putin successfully attacked the 2016 election to help Trump, and Trump aided and abetted this assault by denying or dismissing it. He did not assess how the media reported on these critical matters, a mixed record. Instead, he defined the Russia story only by press coverage of the Steele memos and the question of whether Trump directly schemed with Moscow's covert operators. That is, Gerth missed the forest for a few branches on a tree, not even the whole tree. In presenting his highly limited and narrow conception of the scandal, he validated the bogus framework advanced by Trump-Russia denialists and echoed the disinformation that Trump and his minions have spread to deflect attention from Trump's act of betrayal. Most ridiculously, Gerth claimed that the press, with its errors, caused Trump to launch his war on the media and become so paranoid and conspiracy-minded that he could not accept the results of the 2020 election. And it is noted parenthetically here that Marcy Wheeler pounded Gerth too, as did media critic Dan Kennedy, who also assailed the Gerth opus, all linked herein. You can read the Gerth piece, it will take a while, and my own, and decide for yourself who has the better argument. By the way, the Gerth series did trigger another controversy. After it came out, Duncan Campbell, a veteran investigative reporter, credibly claimed that CJR in 2020 had spiked an article that it had commissioned from him on the Nation's, that is the publication, the Nation's denialist coverage of the Russia scandal, a charge CJR did not accept. As the former Washington editor of The Nation, I was saddened by Campbell's report that showed The Nation, driven by an anti-Russia obsession, had bypassed editorial and fact-checking processes to publish articles that bizarrely insisted there had been no Russian hack of the Democratic Party and no attack of the election. Now back to Girth's piece. What I'd like to highlight is how the usual suspects rushed to embrace it and push their baseless assertion that there was no there in the Trump-Russia scandal, and how these Russian hoaxers, so consumed by an anti-media bias, cannot have a clear debate or discussion about the matter. Writer Matt Taibbi, not surprisingly, was quick out of the gate on this. For years, he has insisted the Russia scandal did not truly exist. He lived there for a while, so that's kind of weird. Refusing to acknowledge that there was any significant Moscow attack in the 2016 election, or that Trump ran interference for a foreign adversary that was subverting American democracy. After I published my take on Girth's article, he tweeted at me, "Dude, you need to find a new line of work, LOL." That's pretty serious, really. This was typical derision instead of debate. I responded, "Way to engage with an argument." Taibbi then countered by cherry-picking a single sentence from my article in which I had noted, in a sense, there was a secret alliance during the 2016 campaign between Trump and Russia. His retort, "In a sense, like in your mind, in a sense, that's not how we do it, and you know it." And at this point, Elon Musk, you've heard of him, jumped in, boosting this Taibbi tweet with one word, "Wow." Taibbi thought he had me, but he had mischaracterized my point. The next sentence in the article read, at least in a wink and nod fashion, I was referring to the June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower between Trump's top advisors, that would be Donald Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, and a Russian emissary who, they were told, would deliver them dirt on Hillary Clinton. In the emails setting up this rendezvous, the Trump men were informed that this meeting was arising from a secret Kremlin effort to help Trump. I love it, Trump Jr. emailed the business associate who helped broker this get-together. So yes, a secret alliance of sorts. The Kremlin would covertly scheme to help Trump, and the Trump camp would not tell the FBI or say anything about it. Trump and his aides would even deny Russia was doing this, and not coincidentally, Manafort was covertly communicating with a Russian intelligence operative and passing him campaign information, which of course was then passed to the Internet Research Agency, who used it to exacerbate the seams, the schisms in American politics. But that's for another day. So I, David Corn, responded by asking if Taibbi had read what I had written after the sentence he tried to mock, and I replied to Musk, "You're being conned. If you care about this issue, read the bipartisan Senate Intel Committee report and then let's talk." I know Musk is a busy man. It's hard to run a financially failing social media site while overseeing a car company whose stock value is plummeting. Thus, I bothered him with another tweet. You're being conned by bad faith actors who are helping Putin and Trump. If you are serious and care about this issue, read the bipartisan Senate Intel Committee report and then let's talk. I was referring, of course, to the 966-page Volume 5 of the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on the Trump-Russia scandal, which was released in 2020 and which remains the best and most damning, I guess, account of this whole business. It details the Russian attack, notes Trump tried to deny this assault while seeking to benefit from it, and reveals how Manafort was interacting, colluding, collaborating with that Russian intelligence officer. No one should be allowed to debate the Russia controversy without reading this. At this point, Taibbi went silent. Personal attacks and selective citation were all he had, and there were crickets from Musk, who apparently was available to boost Taibbi's sophomoric reply, but unavailable to have a serious discussion. This is standard operating procedure for Trump-Russia denialists. No shocker, Glenn Greenwald, the former lefty commentator who now helps Tucker Carlson promote Trump-defending conspiracy theories, joined the fray. He hailed the Girth piece, referred to me, David Korn, as the original Steele dossier truther. I was the first journalist to report on the dossier's existence and revealed that the FBI was investigating its allegations, and approvingly quoted an unnamed, quote, analyst who referred to the media reports on Trump's interactions with Russia as a, quote, propaganda campaign. I tried again. I tweeted at Greenwald, how about you read the bipartisan Senate intelligence report and maybe Russian roulette, and then we have a civil conversation regarding what Russia did to influence the 2016 election and how Trump engaged with that effort. No invective or rhetoric, just a conversation about facts. I was referring to the book I co-wrote with Michael Isikoff, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. A few years ago, during a tweet tussle with Greenwald, I had made a similar offer, and like before, there was no reply. I attempted to do the same with another contrarian who loves to scold the media. After my discussion of the Girth piece was posted, Andrew Sullivan tweeted, if this is the best response the MSM has got, it's pretty pathetic. David Korn basically concedes almost every point Girth made and then tries to change the subject. Just apologize and be accountable. Oh my, this might have been the first time I've been accused of being a spokesperson for the mainstream media. More important, Sullivan misrepresented my main contention. Girth had zeroed in on the wrong subjects and avoided the basics. As one Twitter commentator declared to Sullivan, you call changing the subject pointing out that Trump and Girth tried to change the subject. Ever hopeful, I replied to Sullivan, did you read the full Senate Intel Committee report? After you do, let's chat. Meanwhile, I'm not changing the subject. I'm pointing out Girth selectively examined two pieces of the Trump-Russia scandal without considering the main element. Putin attacked and Trump helped. Never heard back. I'm still waiting. I even took a stab with Ed Snowden. The former national security whistleblower who now resides in Russia blew kisses at Girth's piece, noting Corpo Media knowingly suppressed facts that cut against popular narratives, ignored details, eagerly laundered partisan attacks via anonymous sources, and refuses to reflect on mistakes. My response to him? I would ask Snowden if he accepts that Russia attacked the 2016 campaign to help Trump, and that Trump aided the effort by falsely denying it was happening. And how should we regard people who deny these realities and suppress facts that cut against their denialist narratives? Yeah, nada, zip, and zilch from him as well. I really did, to use this moment as the occasion for an honest and open discussion about what happened in 2016 with Trump and Russia and the media coverage, or lack thereof, or all of it. None of the denialists were interested. I realized that Snowden, living in Moscow now with Russian citizenship, may not be free to fully discuss Russia's information warfare against the United States, but in that case, he probably should not engage at all on these topics. As for the others, they appear more interested in using the Girth piece to advance their denialism or to blast the mainstream media they detest, or both. They are not neutral arbiters of media conduct. Taibbi has been roundly and deservedly criticized for his skewed reporting on the so-called Twitter files. Greenwald, a conspiracy theorist, has of late been promoting a story claiming the CIA blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was based on a single anonymous source, the sort of journalism he excoriates when it does not serve his interests. As for Musk, days ago, he amplified a tweet from a pro-Kremlin account that contained disinformation. The claim that hundreds of U.S. and British NATO military trainers and thousands of NATO soldiers have been killed in the Ukraine war. This was false, part of the Russian propaganda campaign that asserts NATO and U.S. soldiers are fighting in Ukraine. But Musk approvingly retweeted this post with his own comment, a tragic loss of life. His tweet received nearly 11 million impressions in half a day. More about that later, perhaps. I think he might be manipulating that. Here was the owner of Twitter promoting Putin's BS. Not the sort of thing a person with a high regard for truth and accuracy would do. On Saturday, Musk followed up this misstep by telling his 128 million followers that they should not believe the media. Some of the smartest people I know actively believe the press. Amazing, he says. This tweet received over 50 million views. Yes, the guy who boosted Kremlin disinformation was encouraging millions to disregard the media entirely. The next day, Musk was partying with Rupert Murdoch at a luxury box at the Super Bowl. hanging with the man who rules a media empire of spin, conspiracy theory, misinformation, and disinformation. Of course, journalists get things wrong and right. Suggesting that reporters ought never to be believed is the act of a demagogue who would rather manipulate truth than champion it. That's what we see with the Trump-Russia denialists. They are not dedicated to informing the public about what happened in 2016. They are committed to another agenda, bashing the mainstream media, protecting Trump, assailing purported liberal groupthink, crusading against the national security establishment, and or beating up on Hillary Clinton and others who cite the Russian attack as a factor that influenced the outcome of that election. They don't want a fair and honest discussion of the truth. They cannot handle it. Well, interesting. There you go. There's actually more to that issue of the newsletter, but that covers the subject and at length at that. I've got some other things I need to update you on before we break for the day. One is this. Let's throw this one out there. I have seen some chatter about this, and it seems to be an important development. The Hill reporting Pence plots unusual legal strategy in fight against subpoena. We reported to you the other day that The Hill had also reported that Pence had been subpoenaed by Jack Smith in the January 6th phase of his investigation. Here, Brett Samuels and Rebecca Bache reporting on his unusual legal strategy. I had seen first, of course, the supposition that he would fight the subpoena on executive privilege grounds. But we have a new, I guess we could call it pleading in the alternative, although I don't know that he is going to be making both pleas. But it would set up an interesting opportunity for us to discuss the practice of pleading in the alternative among lawyers. A very lawyerly thing to do. Two contradictory pleadings are possible. And the fact that they contradict one another is not supposed to be factored into the discussion. And you're asking the judges to view each on its own merits, and they're one or the other. And yes, they're contradictory, and it's weird, and it's the sort of thing that in any other context you would say, you need to make up your mind what your argument is. But they're literally presenting two contradictory arguments and saying, take your pick. One or the other of them should work. And yeah, they're contradictory. You can throw the other one away when you're done if you don't like it. But we have to present both. So get this. Former Vice President Mike Pence is preparing to fight a subpoena from the special counsel investigating Trump, setting up a complex, drawn-out legal fight as the Justice Department ramps up its probe. Pence's resistance to the subpoena, which is consistent with his previous reluctance to testify about the events surrounding January 6th, could come to define the powers and privileges that come with the vice presidency. Finally, we're going to define these things. But more immediately, it could throw a wrench into special counsel Jack Smith's efforts to investigate Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Pence is planning to roll out a novel legal argument, one that hinges on his role on January 6th as the presiding officer of the Senate. This is interesting. Now, rather than, or perhaps in addition to, pleading executive privilege, that is, I'm a member of the executive branch, the vice president of the United States, and I'm under orders of the previous president of the United States not to testify because executive privilege. That's a misunderstanding usually of where the consensus agreement of what executive privilege means, but it makes a certain amount of sense. As a member of the executive branch, I'm under orders from the previous chief executive. He's going to go in a different direction, or at least a supplemental direction. His team is expected to argue that under his former position as president of the Senate, his work technically falls under the legislative branch, which would normally mean, well, you can't claim executive privilege then, right? If you're acting as a legislative branch functionary. Yes, but I have something else to say. He says, with his work technically falling under the legislative branch, he is therefore protected from the Department of Justice's subpoena under the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, according to a source familiar with the vice president's plans. Now, they can be wrong on both counts. Or right on both counts, or right on one or the other. But it's interesting. And an interesting stretch, a test, really. As president of the Senate, are you able to afford yourself the speech and debate clause? You're not a member, per se, but what are you? And is it speech or debate that you're engaging in? I guess, although, interestingly, I mean, it does say fairly specifically that you're protected by the speech and debate clause from answering for or being arrested for, in relation to, speech and debate in the Congress. But of course, his speech and debate participation in the Congress would, based on what he said and did, would exonerate him from, in the course of any investigation. So it's not entirely clear that it's necessary to protect yourself from that. But it would be a convenience to him politically. Is that reason enough to allow him to say, I can't talk to you about the speech or debate that I engaged in, which actually exonerates me in this situation, because it doesn't necessarily exonerate another guy who could bear on my political fortunes? Well, anyway, that's pretty interesting. The clause, of course, which offers protection from being questioned in any other place beyond legislative chambers, has traditionally been used by lawmakers. I really think that if Vice President Pence is successful in this, it will morph our understanding of separation of powers. I think that success for him is unlikely because the Constitution is very clear about which branch the vice president belongs to, says Juliet Sorensen, a law professor at Northwestern University. But some see the vice president's unique, if only periodic, role in the Senate as affording such protections. Roy Brownwell, a expert in separation of powers who has penned a paper examining the vice president's role, said courts have generally interpreted the clause broadly, with the protections previously extended to include activities beyond direct lawmaking, and in some cases even applying to congressional staff. It's interesting, too, because Dick Cheney was famously expansive in his view of these things, whereas Liz Cheney, his daughter, might view things differently when it comes to getting to the bottom of this particular situation. I wonder. Some constitutional clauses are interpreted very narrowly and some very broadly, and speech or debate has been interpreted broadly, Brownell said. That's right, I think. The key issue for Pence will be trying to demonstrate that his conversations with Trump constituted legislative activity. It really doesn't, especially since it was his argument that this was merely a ceremonial role, a ministerial function, certainly not lawmaking. The vice president may choose to spend 99% of his time not with legislative branch stuff, Brownell noted, but the role includes unique features that indicate Senate membership. Like he gets to break ties, right? They would have a vote, so that's something. He also pointed to a statute laying out federal government organization that defines member of Congress as including the vice president. Well, that'll argue in favor for him. If you figure that you can break tie votes and the fact that he gets his paycheck from the Senate, wow, is that right? Those are pretty clear indications that at least when he's acting in his legislative capacity in the Senate, that he is part of that branch, Brownell said. While Pence wrote at length in his memoir about his conversations with Trump and his interactions with Trump's legal team leading up to January 6th, he has resisted testifying under oath about the events around that day. While former Pence officials from the White House testified last year to the House panel investigating the January 6th riots, the former vice president said Congress had no right to his own testimony, which is amazing, given that if he was, in fact, a legislator, they should have had even more right to his testimony. We have the separation of powers under the Constitution in the United States, Pence told CBS News in November, and I believe it would establish a terrible precedent for the Congress to summon a vice president of the United States to speak about deliberations that took place at the White House. The House committee investigating the attack never subpoenaed Pence, however, leaving the question over the compulsory process unconfronted until now. Many attorneys, however, said Pence's argument is a stretch. They noted his role in the Senate comes with limitations not imposed on the chamber at large, including that the vice president isn't allowed to speak or debate. That's something in the upper chamber without permission from a senator. That's going to be, I mean, the phrasing of that is pretty poignant, right? Can you claim protection of the speech and debate clause if you are specifically prohibited from speaking or debating without the permission of a senator. I'm a skeptic, said Neil Eggleston, who served as White House counsel under President Obama. Although the Constitution gives the vice president a role in vote counting, the Constitution does not make the vice president a senator. Senators are defined in Article 1. The vice president is not a senator, and I read the speech and debate clause as only applying to senators and representatives. I don't think the language of the Constitution permits any other reading. Sorensen, the Northwestern professor, noted that the language of the subpoena itself will be important in determining the strength of Pence's legal case, particularly if it references his duties in the Senate, such as casting tie-breaking votes and certifying the election, or otherwise characterizes him as a legislator. If Pence's efforts to resist the subpoena are rebuffed, he could choose to appeal, leading to a drawn-out legal fight that could, in turn, hamper Smith's efforts to try to wrap up his investigation. Smith would then be forced to decide how critical Pence's testimony is to his probe into Trump's efforts to overturn the election and what role he had in the violent riots at the Capitol on January 6th. A spokesman for, oh boy, we're way behind. We're going to have to roll our music now. Sorry to Justice on this, but a spokesman for the special counsel declined to comment. Attorneys agreed, however, that speech or debate claims from Pence would only go so far and may not protect him from inquiries Smith may have into Trump's pressure campaign on the vice president. This theory does not keep him from testifying. The most it does is keep him from having to answer some questions, Eggleston said. That's interesting. If you think about what they want to ask him about, it's all about the conversations between the election and January 6th, where Trump was leaning on him to declare that Trump had won and not certify the election and that kind of stuff. Those are the questions they really want to ask him about. And if he thought he was a senator that day, I'm not sure it would apply to the conversations with Trump before January 6th. But I don't think any of this matters because I think the language does not apply to him. Lindsey Graham recently hit a roadblock in his own efforts to claim the privilege, with a judge ordering him to appear before a Georgia grand jury investigating Trump's interference in the election. Brownell said a successful assertion would limit prosecutors to questions outside of Pence's role in certifying the vote. If it involves President Trump's conversations about Pence's role in the electoral count as presiding officer, that clearly has a legislative branch opponent. If it's the public campaign Trump was waging, or whatever dubious things Trump was doing with respect to state elections officials and all that lunacy, that would not seem to have any claim to the electoral count, he said. Okay,
From
interesting theories. We'll see how this develops in the days to come.
You have been listening to Kagro in the morning with David Waldman.
Believe it or not, there is more to that article, a lot longer than I thought, but I think we've covered the substance of it. Now you're up to speed, and there are things you're not up to speed on yet, and that's where Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy comes in. You'll want to hear more by staying tuned, or rather, you want to hear more because you're you. You will hear more by staying tuned now and forever.